The kindness that started it all. Chris Johnson loved riding his bike through the neighborhood, feeling the wind rush past his face as he cruised down the quiet suburban streets. It was one of those perfect late spring afternoons, the kind where the golden sunlight peeked through the trees, dappling the pavement with flickering patches of warmth. He took in the familiar sights, the Petersons' perfectly trimmed hedges, the towering oak tree in front of the Wilsons' house, and the row of colorful mailboxes standing proudly like tiny sentinels. This neighborhood had always been home, a place where everyone knew each other, where kids played until the streetlights flickered on, and where neighbors exchanged friendly waves from their porches. As Chris rounded the corner onto Maple Street, something caught his eye. A small figure bent over an old television set sitting in the front yard of a quaint yellow house. It was Mrs. Garcia, the elderly widow who lived alone at the end of the street. Her silver hair gleamed under the afternoon sun, but her hunched shoulders and slow movements told a different story, one of frustration and exhaustion. Chris slowed his bike, curiosity piqued. He had always liked Mrs. Garcia. She was one of the kindest people in the neighborhood, always ready with a smile or a plate of freshly baked cookies. But lately, she had seemed different, more withdrawn. He hadn't seen her tending to her rose bushes as often, nor had she been out on her porch like she used to. Something about the way she was struggling with that old TV made his heart twist. Without hesitation, he steered his bike toward her driveway, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. "Hey, Mrs. Garcia," he called out gently, not wanting to startle her. "Everything okay?" The elderly woman looked up, surprise flickering across her wrinkled face before softening into a tired smile. "Oh, Chris, dear. I didn't see you there," she sighed, brushing a strand of silver hair from her forehead. "This old thing finally gave up on me, I think. I was hoping to watch my favorite show, but it won't turn on." Chris glanced at the dusty TV, its bulkiness a relic of a past era. He wasn't an expert, but he did love tinkering with electronics. Maybe he could help. "Mind if I take a look?" he offered, already setting his bike against the porch railing. Mrs. Garcia's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Oh, would you? That's very kind of you, dear." Chris knelt beside the TV, examining the back panel with a practiced eye. He checked the cords, wiggling them gently to see if any were loose. He noticed the power plug wasn't pushed in all the way. He pressed it in firmly, but still, the screen remained dark. Mrs. Garcia watched him closely, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. "I don't know what I'd do without my shows," she admitted with a small, self-deprecating chuckle. "They keep me company." Chris glanced up at her, suddenly understanding that it wasn't just about the TV. It was about the loneliness that crept in when the house was too quiet, when the days stretched long without a familiar voice to break the silence. He worked carefully, unscrewing the back panel to reveal the intricate tangle of circuits and wires. "Let's see. I think there might be a loose connection here," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He adjusted a few wires, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated. A few minutes later, the television crackled to life, the screen flickering before finally settling into a clear picture. Mrs. Garcia gasped, clapping her hands together. "Oh my goodness, you did it, Chris. You really did it." Chris grinned, feeling a swell of pride. "It wasn't too hard," he said modestly, standing up and dusting off his jeans. Tears glistened in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she looked at him. "Thank you so much, dear. You have no idea how much this means to me." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "This TV, it was a gift from my late husband. I thought I'd lost it forever." Chris swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. He hadn't realized how much this old TV meant to her. Fixing it had been more than just a good deed. It had restored a precious memory. Mrs. Garcia suddenly brightened. "Oh, I know just how to thank you. How about some cookies? I baked a fresh batch this morning." Chris's face lit up. "That sounds great, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you." As they walked toward the house, Mrs. Garcia placed a gentle hand on Chris's shoulder. "You're a very special young man, Chris," she said softly. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Chris felt warmth spread through him at her words. As he stepped inside the cozy home, he realized something. He hadn't just fixed a television. He had helped bring a little light back into Mrs. Garcia's world. And he had no idea that this one simple act of kindness was about to change his life forever. Chris stepped into Mrs. Garcia's home, immediately enveloped by the scent of cinnamon and chocolate. It was a warm, inviting aroma, the kind that reminded him of home, of safety, of lazy Sunday mornings when his mom would bake just because. The living room was small but cozy, with floral-patterned furniture that looked as though it had been around for decades. Framed photos lined the walls, capturing moments of joy. Wedding pictures, smiling children he didn't recognize, and an old black-and-white portrait of a young man in a police uniform. Chris recognized him from the stories Mrs. Garcia had told. That was Henry, her late husband. "Come, dear, sit," Mrs. Garcia urged, motioning toward the wooden kitchen table. She bustled over to the counter, her movements slow but practiced. Chris sat down, his fingers tracing the grain of the table as he took in his surroundings. The home had a warmth to it, but also an undeniable stillness. Too many empty chairs, too much quiet. "Here we go," Mrs. Garcia said as she set a plate of golden brown cookies in front of him, along with a glass of cold milk. She sat across from him, watching expectantly. Chris took a bite and immediately groaned in delight. "These are amazing," he exclaimed, his voice muffled by the mouthful of gooey chocolate. Mrs. Garcia chuckled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "I'm glad you like them. Baking has always been my way of passing the time." She sighed, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Ever since Henry passed, I don't have many people to bake for anymore." Chris hesitated mid-bite, glancing up at her. The sadness in her voice was subtle but undeniable. "Well," he said after a moment, swallowing, "I could definitely help with that. You can bake for me anytime, Mrs. Garcia." She chuckled, but this time there was something softer, more genuine in her expression. "You remind me of Henry," she said, her voice far away as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. "He was always helping people. It didn't matter if it was fixing a stranger's car or carrying groceries for the neighbors. He just couldn't stand seeing someone struggle." Chris shifted in his chair, suddenly feeling honored by the comparison. He had never met Henry, but from the way Mrs. Garcia spoke of him, he must have been a great man. "Sounds like he was a hero," Chris said, his voice quieter now. Mrs. Garcia's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "He was. But do you know what he used to say?" Chris shook his head. "He used to say that kindness doesn't have to be grand to be powerful. That the smallest gestures, a smile, a listening ear, a helping hand, can mean more than people realize." Chris sat with that for a moment, the words settling deep in his chest. Mrs. Garcia patted his hand gently. "And today, you reminded me of that." Chris felt his ears heat up, but he smiled. "I'm just glad I could help." They sat there, talking and eating cookies as the sun slowly began to dip below the horizon. Mrs. Garcia told him stories about her younger days, about how she and Henry used to go dancing on Friday nights, about the way he proposed to her in the pouring rain because he couldn't wait another day. Chris, in turn, told her about school, about his dream of becoming an engineer, about how he loved taking things apart just to see how they worked. By the time he finally stood to leave, the house felt different, less empty, more alive. "Come back any time, dear," Mrs. Garcia said as she walked him to the door. Chris nodded. "I will." As he pedaled home, the streetlights flickering to life above him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had set out that afternoon just hoping to help a neighbor. He hadn't expected to find a friend. And he definitely hadn't expected that friend to bring a police officer to his doorstep the very next day. An unexpected knock at the door. The next morning, Chris awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting warm golden patterns on his bedroom walls. It was a Saturday, the best kind of day, filled with possibilities. Yawning, he stretched his arms over his head, his mind still lingering on the previous afternoon. Helping Mrs. Garcia had felt different, special. He had planned to swing by her house again today, maybe help her with any other small things she needed, maybe even just sit and chat like they had yesterday. He hadn't realized how much he enjoyed listening to her stories, how easily they painted pictures in his mind of a time long before he was born. Sliding out of bed, Chris pulled on a fresh t-shirt and some jeans, then made his way downstairs where the smell of bacon and eggs filled the air. "Morning, sleepyhead," his mom greeted, setting a plate down on the table. His dad, seated with a newspaper in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, glanced up. "You were out later than usual yesterday. Where'd you go?" Chris grinned, grabbing a fork. "I was at Mrs. Garcia's house. I fixed her TV." His mom raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, that's very sweet of you." "She invited me in after," Chris continued, taking a bite of eggs. "We talked for a while. She told me all these stories about her husband, Henry. He was a police officer." His dad set down his paper. "I remember Henry. He was a good man, always looking out for everyone." Chris nodded. She said the same thing. I think she gets really lonely, though." His mom sighed softly. "I imagine she does. Losing someone you love, especially after so many years together, can be incredibly difficult." Chris thought about that, about the way Mrs. Garcia's voice had softened whenever she talked about Henry. He didn't fully understand loss, not in the way adults did, but he understood loneliness, and he never wanted Mrs. Garcia to feel that way. "I was going to stop by her house again later," he said. His mom smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart." Just as Chris finished his breakfast, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't the light tap of a neighbor or the quick rapping of a friend. It was firm, deliberate. His dad frowned, setting his coffee down as he rose to answer it. Chris followed, curiosity bubbling in his chest. When the door swung open, his stomach dropped. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Garcia, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a police officer. His uniform was neatly pressed, a badge gleaming under the morning sun. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a steady, unreadable expression. Chris's breath hitched. Had something happened? Was Mrs. Garcia okay? His dad straightened slightly. "Mrs. Garcia. Officer, is everything all right?" Mrs. Garcia's hands were clasped together, her fingers twisting in nervous movements. "Oh, I'm so sorry for the sudden visit, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I needed to speak with you all." Chris's mom appeared in the hallway, concern etched across her face. The officer, sensing their confusion, spoke next. His voice was deep, steady, but not unkind. "I'm Officer Ramirez," he introduced himself. "I work with the local department." He turned his gaze to Chris. "And I understand you helped Mrs. Garcia yesterday." Chris blinked. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. Yeah, I fixed her TV," he said hesitantly, exchanging a quick glance with his dad. Officer Ramirez nodded slowly, as if considering something carefully. Then, to Chris's shock, he smiled. "Well, son," he said, his voice warm now, "it turns out that wasn't just any ordinary good deed." Chris furrowed his brows, completely lost. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Garcia finally stepped forward, her eyes welling with tears, though she wasn't upset. If anything, she looked overwhelmed. "Oh, Chris," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You have no idea what you've done for me." She took a deep breath, as if steadying herself before speaking again. "You see," she continued, "after you left yesterday, I kept thinking about Henry. How much he would have loved to meet you. How much you remind me of him." Chris felt his throat tighten. Mrs. Garcia turned to the officer beside her. "I went to the police station this morning," she admitted. I needed to be somewhere that reminded me of him. She smiled faintly. Henry always said the station was his second home. Officer Ramirez nodded. That's where I met her. She was telling some of the younger officers about her husband, about what an amazing officer he was. And then, he turned his gaze back to Chris. She started talking about you. Chris's stomach flipped. Me? Mrs. Garcia nodded quickly. Yes, dear. I told them about how kind you've been to me, how you fixed my television without a second thought, how you sat and listened to my stories. Her voice wavered slightly. And I realized something, Chris. The whole world seemed to go still. She reached out, gently taking his hands in hers. I realized that for the first time in a very, very long time, I didn't feel alone. Chris felt something tighten in his chest, something warm and heavy and overwhelming all at once. His mom gasped softly behind him, and his dad's grip on his shoulder tightened ever so slightly. I wanted the officers to know that kindness like yours still exists, Mrs. Garcia continued. That even in a world that can sometimes feel cold and distant, there are still people like you, Chris. People who care, who take the time to make a difference. Chris swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Officer Ramirez cleared his throat. Mrs. Garcia wanted us to recognize what you've done, he said. So we made a few calls. Chris blinked. Calls. The officer smiled. We contacted the city. Next weekend, at the Community Awards ceremony, we'd like to present you with a Community Service Award. Chris's eyes widened. What? Mrs. Garcia nodded eagerly. It's a way to say thank you, dear. Not just from me, but from everyone. What you did may have seemed small to you, but to me, it was everything. Chris's mouth opened, but no words came out. Him, getting an award. For fixing a TV. For sitting with Mrs. Garcia and listening to her stories. His heart pounded. He glanced at his parents, expecting them to be just as shocked as he was. But instead, they both looked proud. His mom wiped at the corner of her eye. His dad cleared his throat and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We'd be honored, his father said, his voice thick with emotion. Chris swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Yeah, he finally said. I'd love to. Mrs. Garcia let out a small, teary laugh, squeezing his hands tightly. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of his home with a police officer on one side and a beaming old woman on the other, Chris realized something. Kindness had a way of coming full circle. And his life. It would never be the same. More than just an award. The news of Chris's upcoming Community Service Award spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By Monday, nearly everyone knew about it. His teachers, his classmates, even the cashier at the corner store who always gave him extra gum. At school, kids who had never spoken to him before suddenly clapped him on the back, calling him a hero and a good guy. His best friend, Marcus, whistled as they walked to their lockers. Man, I can't believe you're getting an award for fixing a TV, Marcus teased, shaking his head. I should have been helping old ladies this whole time. Chris rolled his eyes but grinned. It wasn't just the TV, he explained. It was about Mrs. Garcia. She. Marcus waved him off. Yeah, I know. You're like a grandson to her now. It's sweet, really. He smirked. But don't think I'm letting you off easy. Hero or not, you still owe me a rematch in basketball. Chris laughed, shoving his friend lightly. Deal. But as the day went on, something began to nag at Chris. An award. He hadn't helped Mrs. Garcia for recognition. He had done it because it felt right. Because she had needed someone. Because he had wanted to. Did he really deserve a big ceremony for something that had just felt natural? That question followed him home, hanging in his mind like an overcast sky. A heart-to-heart with Mrs. Garcia. That afternoon, Chris pedaled down Maple Street, his thoughts swirling as he neared Mrs. Garcia's house. She was waiting for him on the porch, as if she had known he was coming. Well, there's my favorite visitor, she called, smiling warmly. Chris couldn't help but smile back. He leaned his bike against the railing and took a seat beside her on the old wooden swing. For a few moments, they just sat there, enjoying the cool breeze and the scent of freshly bloomed flowers from her garden. Finally, Chris took a deep breath. "Mrs. Garcia." "Yes, dear." He hesitated. "I don't know if I should go to the award ceremony." Mrs. Garcia's smile faltered. "Oh, and why's that?" Chris sighed, kicking at the wooden floor beneath his feet. I didn't do anything special. I fixed your TV. I listened to your stories. That's not exactly saving the world." Mrs. Garcia studied him for a moment, then took his hand in hers, her touch warm and comforting. "Oh, Chris," she said softly, "that's where you're wrong." She leaned back slightly, her eyes gazing toward the sky as if searching for the right words. "When Henry was alive, he used to tell me that the world isn't changed by big acts alone. It's changed by the little things, by kindness, by people choosing to be there for each other, even when no one's watching." Chris swallowed hard. "You didn't just fix a television, dear," Mrs. Garcia continued. "You saw me. You noticed that I was alone, that I was struggling, and instead of just riding past like so many others, you stopped." She squeezed his hand gently. "That's what made the difference." Chris felt his throat tighten. "I went to the police station that day because I wanted to tell people that good still exists in the world," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I wanted you to know that your kindness, it matters." Chris looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he understood. It had never been about fixing a TV. It had been about showing up, about choosing to care. And maybe, just maybe, that was what being a hero really meant. The ceremony that changed everything. The following Saturday, Chris stood in front of hundreds of people at the community center. His parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Marcus and some of his classmates had come too, hooting and clapping when his name was called. And beside his parents, sitting with tears glistening in her eyes, was Mrs. Garcia. Officer Ramirez stood at the podium. "Today, we are honoring someone who embodies what it truly means to serve a community, not with money, not with grand gestures, but with a heart full of kindness." Chris shifted nervously as people clapped. He still wasn't sure he deserved all this. But then he glanced at Mrs. Garcia, saw the way she looked at him as if he had changed her life, and suddenly, it didn't matter. Officer Ramirez continued, "Chris Johnson, through a simple act of kindness, reminded us all that small actions can have the biggest impact. His willingness to be there for a neighbor in need didn't just fix a television, it changed a life." The audience erupted into applause as Officer Ramirez handed Chris the Community Service Award, a plaque with his name engraved on it. Chris held it in his hands, his heart pounding. He turned to the microphone, his palms sweaty. He hadn't planned to speak, but somehow he found his voice. "Oh, wow," he began, clearing his throat. I honestly don't know what to say." The crowd chuckled softly. Chris took a deep breath. "I didn't do this for an award. I did it because it felt like the right thing to do." He glanced at Mrs. Garcia, who nodded encouragingly. "I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking that making a difference has to be huge," Chris continued. "But Mrs. Garcia taught me that even the smallest kindness can mean the world to someone." He looked out at the audience, at all the faces watching him. "So if there's anything I want people to take away from this, it's that you don't have to be a superhero to make a difference. Sometimes, all it takes is stopping to help someone. Listening. Being a friend." The room fell silent for a moment. And then, thunderous applause. Chris stepped back, stunned, as people rose to their feet. His mom wiped at her eyes. His dad gave him a thumbs up. Marcus grinned, whistling loudly. And Mrs. Garcia. She simply placed a hand over her heart, smiling so brightly it could have lit up the entire room. A new beginning. After the ceremony, people came up to shake Chris's hand, to congratulate him. But the moment that mattered most, when Mrs. Garcia took his hands in hers and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, dear." Chris smiled, squeezing her hands. "I wouldn't be here without you, Grandma Garcia." She blinked at him, surprised. Then, with tears in her eyes, she pulled him into a tight hug. And just like that, it was official. Mrs. Garcia wasn't just his neighbor anymore. She was family. And as Chris walked out of that community center, the plaque tucked under his arm and Mrs. Garcia's arm linked with his, he knew. This was just the beginning. A family beyond blood. The sun hung low in the sky as Chris and Mrs. Garcia strolled home from the community center, the applause from the ceremony still ringing in his ears. The weight of the award plaque in his hands felt both heavy and light, heavy with responsibility, yet light with joy. Mrs. Garcia walked beside him, her step slower than his but no less determined. There was something different about her today. She wasn't just smiling, she was beaming, her eyes brighter than Chris had ever seen them. As they reached her front porch, she let out a contented sigh, taking the seat on the wooden swing. Chris followed, setting the award down beside him. "Well, dear," she said, patting his hand gently. "That was quite the ceremony." Chris nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, it was. A lot." Mrs. Garcia chuckled. "And how do you feel?" Chris thought about it. He wasn't sure how to put it into words. I feel grateful," he admitted after a moment. "Not for the award, but for everything. For you." Mrs. Garcia's eyes softened. "Oh, Chris." He looked down at his hands, hesitating. "You know, I never really thought much about what it means to have a real connection with someone. I mean, I have my parents, I have Marcus, but—" He trailed off, then took a deep breath. "Spending time with you. It's different. You remind me of my grandma." Mrs. Garcia's lips trembled slightly. Chris swallowed. "I never got to know her well. She passed when I was little. But I always wished I had a grandma to talk to tell me stories, to just be there." Mrs. Garcia reached out, cupping his face with her warm, wrinkled hands. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered. "You do have a grandma. Right here." Chris felt something shift in his chest, something warm, something solid. He had gained more than an award that day. He had gained a grandmother, a new tradition. The following week, Mrs. Garcia invited Chris and his parents over for dinner. She was nervous about it. Chris could tell by the way she fluttered around the kitchen, adjusting plates and wiping the already spotless counter. "What if they don't like my cooking?" she fretted, fussing with a bowl of homemade mashed potatoes. Chris laughed, grabbing a spoon to sneak a bite. "Trust me, Grandma Garcia, once they taste this, they'll never want to eat anywhere else." Mrs. Garcia swatted at him playfully, but she was smiling. When his parents arrived, his mom carried a dish of roasted vegetables, and his dad brought a bottle of sparkling cider. "Mrs. Garcia, thank you for inviting us," his mother said warmly. "Oh, please," Mrs. Garcia waved her off with a chuckle. "If we're going to be family, let's act like it. Call me Abuela if you'd like." Chris's mom smiled. "Abuela, it is." Chris grinned. Seeing his parents so at ease in Mrs. Garcia's home, laughing and sharing stories over dinner, made something settle inside of him. This felt right. This felt like home. Growing together. As weeks passed, Chris's bond with Mrs. Garcia deepened. Some days, they sat on the porch, watching the world go by. Other days, they worked on little projects together, Chris fixing old gadgets while Mrs. Garcia cooked up something new in the kitchen. One afternoon, as Chris was fiddling with an old radio she had in the attic, Mrs. Garcia brought over a photo album. "These are my favorite memories," she said, flipping open the first page. Chris leaned in, fascinated. The pictures were old, black and white, some faded at the edges. "That's Henry and me on our wedding day," she said, pointing to a photo of a young woman in a beautiful lace dress, holding onto the arm of a tall, handsome man in uniform. Chris smiled. You guys looked happy. Oh, we were, she said, her voice soft. Page after page, she shared pieces of her life. Her childhood, her travels, her greatest joys. Then, as they neared the end of the album, she paused on a blank page. Chris frowned. No pictures here. Mrs. Garcia shook her head with a knowing smile. Not yet. She looked at him, her eyes twinkling. This album is full of my past. But my present, my future, well, I think it needs some new memories. Chris's heart swelled. Then let's make some, he said with a grin. A lesson in giving back. One evening, as Chris sat at Mrs. Garcia's kitchen table working on homework, she suddenly asked, Chris, do you know what Henry loved most about being a police officer? Chris looked up from his math book. What? She smiled. Helping people. He believed that when you have the ability to make a difference, you should always take it. Chris sat with that for a moment. Mrs. Garcia tilted her head. Have you ever thought about volunteering? Chris blinked. Like at a soup kitchen or something. Exactly, she said. There's a community center not far from here. Henry and I used to help out there. I think you'd be wonderful at it. Chris hesitated. He had never really considered giving back beyond helping Mrs. Garcia. But as he thought about it, he realized, why stop at just one person? The next week, he and Mrs. Garcia visited the community center together. There he met kids who needed tutoring, families who needed groceries, and elders who just wanted someone to talk to. Chris found himself drawn to a little boy named Eli, who was struggling with reading. At first, Eli barely spoke, his small hands gripping his book tightly, as if it might disappear. But little by little, as Chris read with him each week, the boy began to open up. And when Eli finally finished an entire book on his own, he beamed up at Chris with pride. Chris felt something click inside of him. This was what Mrs. Garcia had meant. This was what Henry had believed in. Helping someone didn't have to be big. It didn't have to be flashy. It just had to be real. A new purpose. One evening, as Chris and Mrs. Garcia sat together watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, Chris, you know what I see in you. He raised an eyebrow. A future NBA star. She laughed. Maybe, but more than that. I see someone who cares. She touched the old watch on his wrist, the one that had belonged to Henry. You have a good heart, my boy. And I know, without a doubt, that you are meant for great things. Chris looked down at the watch, its ticking steady against his skin. For the first time, he believed her. He wasn't just a kid who had fixed a TV. He was someone who could make a difference. And he was just getting started. A family beyond blood. Chris sat beside Mrs. Garcia on the porch swing, the soft creaking blending with the chirping of crickets in the warm evening air. The sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender, casting a peaceful glow over the neighborhood. The events of the past week still felt surreal. The Community Service Award, the applause, the way people had started recognizing him, not just as a regular kid, but as someone who had made a difference. And yet, as much as the recognition meant something, what truly mattered was sitting beside him. Mrs. Garcia. Her fingers absent-mindedly tapped against the armrest, a thoughtful look on her face. Chris noticed the way she stared at the horizon, as if lost in some far-off memory. Grandma, he asked gently. She turned to him, smiling at the name. He had only recently started calling her that, but each time it made her eyes twinkle with joy. Yes, dear. Chris hesitated, then spoke the thought that had been bothering him all day. I never asked. What was it like, winning an award? Mrs. Garcia chuckled. Oh, my dear boy, I've never won an award in my life. Chris frowned. Really? Not even for baking? You should get a gold medal for your cookies. She laughed, shaking her head. No awards, no medals. But that never mattered to me. Henry used to say that the best kind of recognition isn't what the world sees. It's what you feel inside. Chris mulled over her words. "Do you feel proud?" she asked, watching him closely. Chris shrugged. "I guess. I just—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "I don't want people thinking I helped you just to get something out of it." Mrs. Garcia reached over and patted his knee. "Oh, Chris, the people who matter know why you did it, and that's what counts." Chris exhaled, nodding slowly. A comfortable silence settled between them, but it didn't last long. Mrs. Garcia suddenly straightened, an idea lighting up her face. "Chris, I have something for you." He raised an eyebrow. "Another batch of cookies." She chuckled. "Not this time. Follow me." A gift of legacy. Chris followed her inside, the familiar warmth of her home wrapping around him like a blanket. He had come to love this place. The old wooden floors, the soft floral scent, the shelves lined with books and photographs. Mrs. Garcia walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the living room. It was old, its brass handles tarnished with time. She knelt down, lifting the lid carefully. Chris leaned in, watching as she rummaged through neatly folded blankets and stacks of letters tied with ribbons. Finally, she pulled out a small wooden box and turned to him, her expression gentle but serious. "This," she said, holding it out to him, "belonged to Henry." Chris hesitated before taking it. The box was smooth and well-worn, its lid engraved with initials. H.E. His fingers traced the letters. "What is it?" Mrs. Garcia motioned for him to open it. Chris carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a police badge, Henry's badge. His breath hitched. This was Henry's most cherished possession, Mrs. Garcia said, her voice thick with emotion. He used to say that a badge wasn't just metal, it was a promise. A promise to always help, to always protect, to always do what's right. Chris swallowed hard, staring at the badge. It was old but well-preserved, polished, and gleaming under the soft living room light. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Garcia, I can't take this." She shook her head. "Oh, but you can. And you should." Chris's heart pounded. "But I'm not a police officer." "No," she agreed. "But you are someone who helps people, just like Henry did. This badge isn't about the job. It's about the heart behind it." Chris stared at the badge again. He thought about Eli at the community center, about how he had struggled with reading, but kept trying, about the way his face had lit up when he finally finished his first book. He thought about the way Mrs. Garcia had smiled when he first called her grandma, the way she had softened when she realized she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe she was right. Maybe helping people didn't require a uniform. Maybe anyone could carry that promise. Chris gently closed the box, holding it close to his chest. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered. Tears welled in Mrs. Garcia's eyes, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "Oh, Chris," she murmured, "Henry would be so proud of you." And for the first time, Chris truly felt it. Not just the pride, but the responsibility. The promise. The beginning of something bigger. The next few weeks were different. Chris wasn't just helping Mrs. Garcia anymore. He was helping everyone. At school, he started tutoring kids who needed extra help. At the community center, he took on more responsibility, organizing events and encouraging other kids to get involved. He even started visiting other elderly neighbors, offering to mow lawns, carry groceries, or simply sit and chat. And the more he did, the more he realized kindness was contagious. One afternoon, as he helped Eli with another book, the little boy looked up at him, eyes shining. "When I get older," Eli said, "I want to help people too." Chris smiled, ruffling the kid's hair. "You already are, buddy." A name that meant something. One evening, Chris sat on Mrs. Garcia's porch, watching the sunset. He glanced down at the badge in his pocket, feeling its weight. He had started wearing it on a chain around his neck, not as a decoration, but as a reminder. A reminder of Henry, of Mrs. Garcia, of what really mattered. Mrs. Garcia sipped her tea, then glanced at him. "What's on your mind, dear?" Chris hesitated, then grinned. "I've been thinking, maybe I should start a club at school. A volunteer group. Something to help kids get involved in the community." Mrs. Garcia's eyes lit up. "Oh, Chris, that's wonderful." He nodded, excitement bubbling in his chest. "But I don't know what to call it." Mrs. Garcia tapped her chin, then she smiled. "How about Henry's Promise?" Chris blinked. The words settled in his heart like a perfect fit. Henry's Promise. A promise to be there. To help. To choose kindness, always. Chris grinned. "I love it." Mrs. Garcia beamed. And just like that, something new began. A movement. A legacy. And for Chris, it was only the beginning. The birth of Henry's Promise. The idea of Henry's Promise consumed Chris's thoughts. Every time he looked at the badge, now hanging around his neck, he felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a purpose. He had never started anything before, never been the leader of a club, never stood in front of a group of people with a mission. But as he sat on Mrs. Garcia's porch, flipping the badge between his fingers, he realized that this wasn't just his idea. This was Henry's dream, and it was time to make it real. The first step. The next morning, Chris stood outside his school, shifting nervously as he clutched the sign-up sheet in his hands. Henry's Promise. A volunteer group for anyone who wants to make a difference. It sounded good, but what if no one cared? What if they laughed? What if no one showed up? Just as he was about to lose his nerve, Marcus clapped him on the back. "Dude, chill. It's gonna be great." Chris exhaled. "What if no one signs up?" Marcus snorted. "Bro, you're literally the kid who got an award for helping people. Trust me, people are gonna sign up." Chris wanted to believe him. But the fear of failure was a powerful thing. As the lunch bell rang, students filed into the cafeteria, their conversations buzzing through the air. Chris set up his table near the entrance, taping the sign-up sheet to the front. And then he waited. At first, nothing. People looked, but they didn't stop. Chris's stomach twisted. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just. "Yo, you're the kid who fixed that old lady's TV, right?" Chris turned to see a boy from his grade, Eric, leaning against the table. Yeah," Chris said. Eric nodded, looking at the sign-up sheet. "So what's this about?" Chris swallowed, forcing himself to speak with confidence. "It's about helping people," he said. "Henry's Promise is a volunteer group. Tutoring, helping neighbors, food drives, just making a difference." Eric studied him for a second. Then he grabbed the pen and signed his name. Chris blinked. "Wait, you're in?" Eric shrugged. "Yeah, why not? My grandma's been having trouble with her yard. Maybe we could help her out or something." Chris grinned. "That's exactly the idea." And then, like a spark catching fire, more people came. One by one, students walked up, curious at first, then inspired. By the time lunch ended, 20 names were on the sheet. Henry's Promise had begun. The first mission. Chris stood in front of his new group after school, nerves bubbling in his stomach. They had gathered in an empty classroom, desks pushed aside so they could sit in a circle. "All right," he began, clearing his throat. "First of all, thank you. I didn't expect this many people to join." Marcus smirked. "Told you." Chris rolled his eyes but smiled. "So, what do we do first?" a girl named Leah asked. Chris thought for a moment. Then he grinned. "I have an idea. Helping hands." The next Saturday, Henry's Promise met at Mrs. Garcia's house. She was stunned when she opened the door to find 20 kids standing on her porch. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. "What is all this?" Chris grinned. "Community service, Grandma." Mrs. Garcia looked at him, then at the kids with rakes, gardening gloves, and bags of soil. Tears welled in her eyes. Henry would be so proud. Over the next 4 hours, they transformed her yard. Weeds were pulled. The garden was replanted. The old wooden fence got a fresh coat of paint. By the time they were done, Mrs. Garcia's house looked brand new. As she wiped away tears, she whispered to Chris, "This isn't just a volunteer group here. This is a movement." Chris felt something settle deep in his chest. She was right. This was only the beginning. Spreading the promise. After that first project, Henry's promise exploded. Word spread through the school. People who had never considered volunteering before were suddenly interested. Chris and his group started organizing. Food drives for the local shelter, tutoring for younger kids, helping elderly neighbors with yard work and home repairs, cleaning up the park. Each time they helped someone, the group grew bigger. People wanted to be part of something real, something that mattered. One afternoon, Chris sat on the community center steps, exhausted but happy, when Officer Ramirez walked up. "I heard about what you've been doing," the officer said, nodding approvingly. "It's impressive, son." Chris smiled. "Thanks. But it's not just me. It's everyone." Officer Ramirez crossed his arms. "Well, I figured someone like you might need some extra support." Chris tilted his head. "What do you mean?" The officer handed him an envelope. Inside was a check for $1,000. Chris's mouth dropped open. "Wah! Where did this come from?" Officer Ramirez smiled. "The city wanted to fund youth initiatives. After hearing about Henry's promise, they decided it was worth investing in." Chris couldn't believe it. With that money, they could do so much more. They could expand. They could change even more lives. And it all started with a broken TV. A legacy in motion. One night, as Chris sat on Mrs. Garcia's porch, he turned to her. "Do you think Henry ever imagined something like this?" Mrs. Garcia smiled, placing a hand over his. "Oh dear, Henry dreamed of a world where people looked out for each other. A world where kindness wasn't rare. It was the norm." Chris nodded, looking down at the badge around his neck. He had started this for Mrs. Garcia. But now it was bigger than both of them. Henry's promise was no longer just about one act of kindness. It was about choosing kindness every day. And Chris, he was ready to keep that promise. For Henry, for Mrs. Garcia, and for the world. A promise that lives on. Chris stood in front of the crowded school gymnasium, his heart pounding as he stared at the sea of expectant faces. It had been 6 months since the first project with Henry's promise. 6 months of food drives, tutoring programs, neighborhood cleanups, and acts of kindness that had transformed the community. And now, somehow, his small group of 20 students had grown into a full-fledged school-wide movement. Posters for Henry's promise decorated the gym walls. Teachers and parents had come to show their support. The mayor had even sent a representative to speak. Chris swallowed hard, gripping the microphone. He had never been great at public speaking, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person whose life had been changed by Henry's promise. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the podium. The speech that started it all. 6 months ago, Chris began, his voice steady. "I fixed an old TV." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Chris smiled. "At the time, I didn't think much of it. I thought I was just helping a neighbor. But I didn't realize that what I was really doing was keeping a promise." He glanced at Mrs. Garcia, sitting in the front row, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Henry Garcia, Mrs. Garcia's late husband, spent his life helping people, Chris continued. "And when I heard about the kind of man he was, the kind of man who never turned his back on someone in need, I knew I wanted to do the same." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But here's the thing. You don't have to wear a badge to change lives. You don't have to be a police officer or a firefighter or a doctor to make a difference. You just have to care." The audience fell silent. Chris took a deep breath. That's what Henry's promise is all about. It's about showing up. It's about choosing kindness, even when no one is watching. And tonight, I want to ask all of you. He looked out at the sea of faces. Are you ready to keep that promise? The gym erupted into cheers. Chris's chest swelled with pride. This was bigger than him now. This was a movement, a community transformed. After the assembly, students rushed to the Henry's Promise booth, signing up for new volunteer projects. Parents shook Chris's hand, thanking him for inspiring their kids. The principal approached him with an idea, making Henry's Promise an official school club, complete with funding for larger projects. Chris was overwhelmed, but in the best possible way. He turned to Mrs. Garcia, who had been watching everything unfold with quiet pride. "What do you think?" he asked, a little breathless from all the excitement. Mrs. Garcia wiped a tear from her cheek. "Oh, Chris, I think Henry would be honored." Chris smiled, feeling the badge hanging around his neck. For the first time, he truly believed it. A new chapter. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Henry's Promise wasn't just a school club anymore. It was spreading citywide. Chris started getting calls from other schools, asking how they could start their own Henry's Promise chapters. The local news station reached out, wanting to do a story about him. And then, one evening, something even bigger happened. His phone buzzed. An email from the city council. Chris's eyes widened as he read the message. Subject: Henry's Promise Scholarship Initiative. Dear Chris, your work with Henry's Promise has inspired not only students but entire communities. The City Council is proud of what you've accomplished, and we believe in what you're building. We'd like to fund an annual scholarship in Henry Garcia's name, awarded to students who demonstrate exceptional commitment to community service. Your leadership has shown that small acts of kindness can create real change. We look forward to working with you to make this dream a reality. Sincerely, Councilwoman Angela Martinez. Chris stared at the screen. His heart was pounding. A scholarship. This wasn't just an after-school club anymore. Henry's Promise was becoming a legacy. The surprise of a lifetime. Chris raced to Mrs. Garcia's house, barely able to contain himself. She opened the door, smiling. "Well, dear, what's got you so?" Chris thrust his phone toward her, too excited to speak. She adjusted her glasses, reading the email carefully. By the time she finished, her hand was covering her mouth, and her eyes were brimming with tears. "A scholarship," she whispered. "In Henry's name." Chris nodded, grinning. Mrs. Garcia looked up at him, shaking her head in wonder. "Oh, Chris, you've done something truly beautiful." Chris swallowed hard. "We did." She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Henry always believed in the power of a single act of kindness," she murmured. "And now, because of you, his kindness will live on forever." Chris felt his throat tighten. He pulled her into a hug, the tightest one yet. This woman, this incredible woman, was his family now. And together, they had changed the world. A promise kept. Years later, Chris sat in the same community center where he had once received his own award, except now he was the one presenting. A group of high school students sat before him, eager, hopeful, ready to carry on the legacy. Behind him, a banner read, "The Henry Garcia Community Service Scholarship." Chris cleared his throat, looking at the faces of the young volunteers. "Years ago," he began, "I fixed a TV." They laughed. Chris smiled. "And that single act of kindness led me here, to a place where kindness isn't just an idea. It's an action. It's a promise." He looked over at Mrs. Garcia, who sat proudly in the front row, still just as sharp and full of life as ever. Then he turned back to the students. "Today, each of you is making a promise to look out for your neighbors, to help those in need, and to always choose kindness." He smiled. "So I ask you, are you ready to keep Henry's promise?" The room erupted into applause. Chris felt his heart swell as he stepped off the stage, knowing without a doubt. This wasn't just his story. It belonged to all of them, and it would live on forever.